The spring mud sucked at Mavis's worn boots as she clutched little Sadie's hand outside the courthouse steps. Her heart hammered against her ribs while she strained to hear Judge Mosely's words through the heavy oak doors. The April wind carried fragments of his voice, mixing with the auctioneer's rapid-fire calling that had been going on since dawn. Property of the late William Harris, she heard clearly. Outstanding debts to be satisfied through public auction. Sadie pressed closer to Mavis's threadbare skirt, her small fingers working the edges of the doll Mavis had sewn from flour sack scraps. The child hadn't spoken since they'd found her daddy 3 weeks ago, face down in the creek with his skull caved in. Nobody would say much about it, just that William had been drinking again and must have slipped on the rocks. Mavis knew better. William Harris had been stone sober for nigh onto 2 months, ever since he'd started asking questions about who held the real deed to his land. Too many questions, it seemed. Bidding will commence at $50 for the homestead and all improvements, the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying clear across the courthouse square. Mavis's blood ran cold. $50 was more money than she'd seen in her entire life. She was William's cousin, his only living kin besides Sadie. But cousin or not, she had nothing but the clothes on her back and the few coins William had hidden in the flour jar. Do I hear 50? $50 for prime farmland with established cabin and outbuildings. 50, came a voice from inside, followed by murmurs Mavis couldn't make out. She pressed closer to the door, Sadie clinging to her skirts. Judge Mosely's voice rose above the crowd. Before we proceed, I must note for the record that the deceased left a minor child, one Sadie Harris, age 7. According to territorial law, arrangements must be made for her care and custody. Mavis's heart leaped. She'd been caring for Sadie these 3 weeks, sleeping on William's kitchen floor, tending his chickens and garden, trying to keep body and soul together while she figured out what to do. If the judge was talking about custody, maybe there was hope. Maybe they'd let her take Sadie proper-like, legal and binding. The child has been residing with Mavis Caldwell, cousin to the deceased, Judge Mosely continued. However, Miss Caldwell lacks the financial means to provide adequate care. Therefore, the court recommends placement with a suitable family of means. The words hit Mavis like a physical blow. She pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. They were going to take Sadie away from her. Take the only family she had left in this world. $60, another voice called out. I hear 60. Do I hear 70? Mavis barely registered the bidding war starting up inside. Her mind reeled with what she'd heard. The judge had said she lacked the means to care for Sadie. It was true enough, she had no husband, no property, no steady income. But she loved that little girl like her own, had been the one to hold her when the nightmares came, had sung her to sleep every night since William died. Mavis. The voice was low, gravelly, spoken close to her ear. She startled and turned to find a tall man in worn denim and a weathered hat standing behind her. She recognized him, Caleb Stone, who ran cattle on the high meadows north of town. He was a widower, she'd heard, kept to himself mostly. Mr. Stone. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. You been standing out here in the cold for nigh onto 2 hours. Child's shivering. His dark eyes took in Sadie's pale face and thin shoulders. Come on. Before Mavis could protest, he was guiding them away from the courthouse steps toward a buckboard wagon hitched at the rail. But I need to hear. You heard enough. His tone was gentle but firm. That little one needs somewhere warm. Mavis hesitated, glancing back at the courthouse. They're auctioning William's place. And the judge said. She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't voice her fear that they'd take Sadie away. Caleb's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. I heard what he said. Question is, what do you aim to do about it? I don't have any money. I can't bid on the land, can't prove I can provide for her proper. The admission tasted bitter as old coffee. Money ain't everything. He lifted Sadie into the wagon bed, where warm blankets were piled high. The child went without protest, her dark eyes wide and watchful. Sometimes it's about what's right, not what's legal. Mavis climbed up beside Sadie, pulling a blanket around both of them. You think there's a difference? I know there is. Caleb settled onto the driver's seat and clicked to his horses. Been plenty of legal things in this territory that weren't right. And plenty of right things that weren't legal. They rode in silence through the rutted streets of Pine Ridge, past the general store and the saloon, past the small white church where William's funeral had been held. Mavis watched the courthouse grow smaller behind them, her stomach churning with worry. By the time they returned, the auction would be over. Sadie's future would be decided by strangers with deep pockets and shallow hearts. Caleb's ranch lay in a valley between rolling hills, where spring grass was already showing green and his cattle dotted the landscape like dark stones. The cabin was larger than William's had been, built solid with chinked logs and a stone chimney that promised warmth. Smoke rose from it now, indicating someone was tending the fire. Mrs. Patterson comes by to cook and clean, Caleb explained, seeing Mavis's questioning look. Lost her husband last winter. Arrangement suits us both. He helped them down from the wagon and led them inside, where a plump woman with graying hair looked up from stirring something that smelled like heaven in a pot over the fire. Mrs. Patterson, this is Mavis Caldwell and Sadie Harris. They'll be staying for supper. Mrs. Patterson took one look at Sadie's pale face and Mavis's worried expression and began bustling around, setting places at the rough wooden table. You look half froze, both of you. Come sit by the fire. Mavis wanted to protest that they couldn't impose, that they needed to get back to town, but Sadie was already moving toward the warmth, and the smell of beef stew was making her stomach cramp with hunger. They hadn't eaten since yesterday's breakfast of cornmeal mush. Sit, Caleb said quietly. We'll talk after you've got some food in you. The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, served with thick slices of bread that Mrs. Patterson had baked that morning. Sadie ate with the focused intensity of a child who'd known hunger, while Mavis tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The auction, she began when the worst of her hunger was satisfied. We'll go on without you, Caleb said. Question is what happens after. I heard the judge say I couldn't provide for Sadie proper. He's right. I got no money, no land, no husband to speak for me. They'll give her to some family in town, or maybe send her east to one of them orphan schools. Her voice broke on the last words. Mrs. Patterson made a soft sound of distress. That poor lamb. She's been through enough. Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying Mavis with those dark eyes. What if you had land? And a way to provide? I don't see how. What if you married? Had a husband to speak for you? The words hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Mavis stared at him, not sure she'd heard right. Mr. Stone, Caleb. And I ain't proposing romance, if that's what's got you looking like a spooked mare. I'm talking about a practical arrangement. You need a husband and a place to raise that child. I need. He paused, glancing toward the fire. Well, let's just say this place gets mighty quiet with just me and the cattle. Mavis's mind reeled. Marriage to a stranger, even one who seemed decent enough, was a desperate solution. But then she thought of Sadie, of the judge's words about suitable families of means. You'd do that? For us. Child needs stability. You clearly love her like your own. Seems to me that's more important than whatever family of means the judge has in mind. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat. If I may say so, Mr. Stone, there's more to consider than just the practical aspects. The girl's been through a terrible loss. She needs time to heal, to trust again. Which is why this arrangement makes sense, Caleb said. No pressure, no expectations beyond what's needed to satisfy the court. Mavis keeps caring for Sadie like she has been, just with legal backing. Sadie had finished eating and was now sitting quietly beside Mavis, the flour sack doll clutched in her lap. She hadn't said a word during the entire conversation, but her eyes moved between the adults, taking everything in with a sharp awareness of a child who'd learned early that grown-up decisions could change everything in an instant. "What about your cattle operation?" Mavis asked. "You'd be taking on 2 more mouths to feed, and I don't know much about ranching." "Ranch work can be learned. And there's plenty needs doing that don't involve cattle. Garden to tend, chickens to care for, house to keep. Mrs. Patterson's been doing it all, but she's got her own place to worry about." The older woman nodded. "I'd be glad to teach you what you need to know, dear. And it would be good to have other women folk around regular like." Mavis looked down at Sadie, who was watching her with those serious dark eyes. The child had lost so much already. Her father, her home, everything familiar. But she seemed comfortable here, had eaten her first full meal in weeks, was warm and safe for the first time since William died. "The judge might not accept it," Mavis said finally. "A hasty marriage, I mean. He might think it's just a scheme." "Then we don't make it hasty," Caleb replied. "We do it proper, with bans posted and everything legal. But first, we go back to town and make sure everyone knows my intentions. That way, when the question of Sadie's custody comes up official-like, there won't be any doubt about her having a proper home." "And if someone else wants to adopt her? Someone with more money?" Caleb's expression hardened. "Then they'll have to go through me. And I don't give up easy on things that matter." The way he said it, with quiet certainty, made Mavis believe him. This man, this stranger who was offering them salvation, had the look of someone who kept his word. But marriage, even a practical one, was a big step. What if it didn't work? What if he changed his mind once the novelty wore off? "I need to think about it," she said. "Course you do. But don't think too long. Word travels fast in a town like Pine Ridge, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that decent opportunities don't wait around forever." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. Caleb rose and moved to the window, his expression growing grim. "Speaking of word traveling fast." Mavis joined him at the window and saw 3 riders approaching the cabin. Even at a distance, she recognized the lead horse, a fancy bay gelding that belonged to Judge Mosely himself. Behind him rode 2 other men she didn't recognize, both dressed in town clothes and wearing the kind of serious expressions that meant official business. "Mrs. Patterson, would you mind taking Sadie to look at the barn cats?" Caleb asked quietly. "Show her the new litter in the hay loft." The older woman understood immediately. "Come along, dear. I believe there's 5 little ones." Just opened their eyes. Sadie went willingly enough, though she cast one worried glance back at Mavis before following Mrs. Patterson outside through the back door. "Whatever they want," Mavis said, her voice tight with fear. "It can't be good." "No," Caleb agreed. "It can't. But that don't mean we have to make it easy for them." The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, and Judge Mosely dismounted with the careful dignity of a man conscious of his position. He was a small, neat man with silver hair and pale eyes that missed nothing. The 2 men with him remained mounted, hands resting casually on their gun belts. "Mr. Stone," the judge called out. "Might I have a word?" Caleb opened the door and stepped onto the porch, Mavis close behind him. "Judge Mosely, what brings you out to my place? I think you know." The judge's eyes found Mavis and fixed on her with cold disapproval. "Miss Caldwell, You missed the conclusion of this afternoon's proceedings. Most irregular, considering your stated interest in the child's welfare. Mavis's heart sank. Is Sadie? The Harris child situation has been resolved, Judge Mosely cut her off. A suitable family has been found. The Whitman family from Denver has expressed interest in adoption. They're people of means and standing, able to provide educational opportunities and social advantages the child would never have otherwise. But I'm her family, Mavis protested. William's blood kin. That has to count for something. Blood relation without the means to provide adequate care counts for very little in the eyes of the law, Miss Caldwell. The child needs stability, education, a proper Christian upbringing in a household with moral authority. The implications of his words hit Mavis like a slap. He was saying she wasn't fit, wasn't moral enough, wasn't good enough to raise Sadie. Heat flared in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Caleb stepped forward. Judge, I believe you're operating under outdated information. Judge Mosely's eyebrows rose. I beg your pardon. Miss Caldwell's circumstances have changed since this morning. We're to be married. The silence that followed was deafening. Mavis felt the world tilt around her as Caleb's words sank in. He'd just announced their engagement to the judge, making it public and official before she'd even given him an answer. Is that so? Judge Mosely's tone was skeptical. Rather convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Love don't always follow convenient timing, Caleb replied evenly. But when it comes, a man's got to act on it. One of the mounted men leaned forward in his saddle. Judge, maybe we should. Be quiet, Briggs. Mosely's sharp command cut off whatever the man had been about to say. His pale eyes moved between Caleb and Mavis, calculating. Even if this sudden engagement is legitimate, it doesn't change the current situation. The child is still without proper custody arrangements. Which we aim to remedy, Caleb said. Once Mavis and I are wed, we'll petition the court for legal guardianship. As her husband, I'll be able to provide the financial stability the court requires. And until then? Until then, she stays with us. As she has been. Judge Mosely's expression grew cold. I'm afraid that's not acceptable. The child will be placed in temporary custody with the Whitman family until proper arrangements can be made. They're departing for Denver tomorrow morning. Mavis's knees nearly buckled. Tomorrow morning. They were taking Sadie away tomorrow, sending her hundreds of miles from everything she knew, from the only person who truly loved her. Judge, she began, her voice shaking. Please. She's been through so much already. To take her away from everyone she knows will be difficult but necessary, Mosely finished. The child needs proper guidance, Miss Caldwell. The kind that comes from established families with moral authority and Christian values. The way he said it made Mavis's blood boil. As if she hadn't been raised in the church, as if she didn't know right from wrong, as if loving Sadie with everything she had wasn't enough. What Christian values are those, Judge? Caleb's voice was deceptively mild. The ones that rip a grieving child away from the only family she has left? The ones that sell a man's property before his body's even cold in the ground? Mr. Stone, I'll thank you not to question the integrity of these proceedings. Everything has been done according to territorial law. Whose law? And whose interpretation? The tension crackled between the two men like lightning before a storm. Mavis could feel something dangerous building, could see it in the way the mounted men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. The child will be collected tomorrow at first light, Judge Mosely said with finality. I trust she'll be ready. And I trust you'll be ready to explain to the territorial governor why you're ignoring kinship rights, Caleb replied. Especially when there's a legal marriage to provide the stability you claim to want. There is no marriage yet, Mr. Stone. Only claims and promises. Then we'll remedy that right now. Caleb turned to Mavis, his eyes intense. Mavis Caldwell, will you marry me? The question hung in the air like smoke. Mavis's mind raced, weighing options that all seemed impossible. If she said yes, she'd be bound to a man she barely knew, dependent on his goodwill, and trapped in an arrangement that might suit him now but could turn sour later. If she said no, Sadie would be taken away forever, sent to strangers who might be kind or might not, who would never love her the way Mavis did. Really, there was no choice at all. Yes, she whispered, then cleared her throat and said it stronger. Yes, I'll marry you. Judge Mosely's face darkened. A hasty wedding won't change anything. The law requires proper witness and ceremony, Caleb interrupted. Which we'll have. Reverend Hayes is in town, isn't he? We can have the ceremony performed tonight, with proper witness. Legal and binding. Even so, the child's custody arrangements will be reviewed in light of the new circumstances, as is proper under territorial law. Caleb's tone brooked no argument. Unless you're saying the court doesn't recognize the sanctity of marriage? Mavis could see the judge struggling with his position. He wanted to take Sadie, that much was clear, but Caleb was backing him into a legal corner. A married woman with a stable home had rights that a spinster cousin didn't. Very well, Mosely said finally. If you can produce a valid marriage certificate by tomorrow morning, the custody hearing will be postponed pending review. But I warn you, Mr. Stone, any irregularities in the proceedings will result in immediate removal of the child. Understood. The judge remounted his horse, his movements sharp with frustration. Tomorrow morning, Mr. Stone. First light. They rode away in a cloud of dust, leaving Mavis and Caleb standing on the porch in the gathering dusk. The magnitude of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. She was getting married. Tonight. To a man she'd met for the first time just hours ago. Caleb, she began, but he held up a hand. Before you say anything, you should know, this changes nothing about our arrangement. Practical marriage like we discussed. You'll have your own room, your own space. The only difference is it'll be legal and binding, give you the protection you need to keep Sadie. Mavis nodded, though her heart was beating fast enough to make her dizzy. And if it doesn't work? If the judge finds some other reason to take her, then we'll deal with that when it comes. But Mavis. He turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes serious. I give you my word, as long as I draw breath, no one's taking that little girl away from you. Not the judge, not the Whitmans, not anyone. The conviction in his voice made something tight in Mavis's chest ease just a little. Maybe this was crazy. Maybe she was making the biggest mistake of her life. But looking at this man who was willing to append his entire existence to help a child he'd never met and a woman he barely knew, she thought maybe, just maybe, she was making the smartest decision she'd ever made. From around back of the cabin came the sound of Sadie's laughter, bright and unexpected in the evening air. It was the first time Mavis had heard that sound since William died, and it made her decision feel right in a way that had nothing to do with judges or laws or practical arrangements. We'd better get to town, she said. Find Reverend Hayes before it gets full dark. Caleb nodded and called out to Mrs. Patterson. They had a wedding to plan, and less than 12 hours to make it happen. But as Mavis looked out over the valley, with its rolling hills and peaceful cattle, and the promise of safety it represented, She thought maybe 12 hours would be enough. Maybe it would have to be. The wedding ceremony took place in Reverend Hayes' small parlor by lamplight, with Mrs. Patterson and the town blacksmith, Samuel Tucker, serving as witnesses. Mavis wore her one good dress, a faded blue calico she'd mended so many times the original pattern was barely visible. Caleb had cleaned up, his dark hair still damp from washing, wearing a white shirt that looked like he'd pressed it himself. Sadie stood beside Mavis throughout the brief ceremony, clutching her flour-sack doll and watching everything with those serious dark eyes. When Reverend Hayes pronounced them man and wife, Caleb bent to shake the child's hand solemnly, as if she were a grown person whose opinion mattered. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Sadie," he said. "I hope we'll be good friends." Sadie studied his face for a long moment, then nodded once. It wasn't much, but it was the first response she'd given anyone besides Mavis since her father died. They returned to the ranch that night as a family, strange as it felt. Mrs. Patterson had prepared the spare room for Mavis and Sadie, with clean sheets on the bed and wildflowers from the meadow on the windowsill. Caleb showed them where everything was, the pump for water, the privy out back, the chicken coop where Sadie could gather eggs in the morning. "Tomorrow we'll start teaching you both about ranch life," he said. "But tonight, just rest. It's been a long day." Mavis lay awake most of the night, listening to Sadie's quiet breathing beside her and trying to process everything that had happened. 12 hours ago she'd been a desperate woman with no prospects. Now she was married to a stranger and living on a cattle ranch, with legal protection for the child she loved more than her own life. When morning came, Judge Mosely arrived as promised, bringing with him the marriage certificate Reverend Hayes had prepared and an expression of barely concealed frustration. He spent an hour going over every detail of the ceremony, looking for irregularities, but found none. The marriage was legal and binding, performed by an ordained minister with proper witnesses. "This doesn't end the matter, Mrs. Stone," he said, the title clearly bitter on his tongue. "The court will be reviewing your suitability as guardians. Any sign that the child isn't receiving proper care?" "She'll receive the best care we can give," Mavis replied firmly. "Better than strangers in Denver ever could." After the judge left, Caleb set about teaching Mavis and Sadie the routines of ranch life. There was more work than Mavis had imagined: cattle to check, fences to mend, a large garden to tend, and the endless cycle of feeding animals and cleaning up after them. But there was also a rhythm to it that Mavis found soothing. The cows needed milking at dawn and dusk. The chickens required feed and fresh water. The garden had to be weeded and watered. It was honest work that left her tired but satisfied at the end of each day. Sadie took to ranch life like she'd been born to it. Within a week she was helping Mavis gather eggs, her small hands gentle with the broody hens. She learned to scatter feed for the chickens and helped Mrs. Patterson in the kitchen, measuring flour and stirring batter for the biscuits they had with every meal. More importantly, she was beginning to talk again. Just a word here and there at first, please, and thank you, and yes, ma'am. But gradually, as the weeks passed and summer settled over the valley, she began to ask questions about the animals and the work, and sometimes even smiled when Caleb told stories about his ornery bull or the time a raccoon family took up residence in his corn crib. Mavis found herself settling into the arrangement more easily than she'd expected. Caleb was a quiet man, but not unkind. He treated her with respectful courtesy, never pressed for more than she was willing to give, and seemed genuinely fond of Sadie. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would sit on the porch while Sadie played with the barn cats, and he would tell them about the land, the cattle, the neighbors they hadn't met yet. "The Weatherbys have the spread to the east," he said one evening in late June, gesturing toward the hills. "Good people, though they keep to themselves mostly. Lost their youngest son in a mining accident last year. Been hard on them. And to the west? Mavis asked, rocking gently in the chair he'd brought out for her. Open range mostly, clear to the Peterson place. Old Henrik Peterson runs sheep, which don't make him popular with the cattlemen, but he's honest and works hard. His wife makes the best apple butter in 3 counties. It was peaceful talk, the kind that helped Mavis understand the community she'd become part of. But she couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was building on the horizon. Too many riders had been passing by the ranch, men she didn't recognize who stopped to water their horses and ask casual questions about the new Mrs. Stone and her circumstances. The first real sign of trouble came in mid-July, when Mavis was hanging laundry behind the cabin and noticed a rider approaching from the south. She recognized him immediately. It was Briggs, one of the men who'd ridden with Judge Mosely that first day. He was alone this time, but that somehow made him seem more dangerous, not less. "Mrs. Stone," he called out as he dismounted near the back porch. "Afternoon, Mr. Briggs." Mavis kept her voice neutral, though every instinct told her to call for Caleb. But he was checking fences in the north pasture and wouldn't be back until evening. "Came to check on how you folks are settling in. Make sure everything's going smooth." "Everything's fine, thank you." Mavis continued hanging clothes, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. "Sadie's doing well, adjusting to ranch life." "That's good to hear. Real good." Briggs moved closer, his eyes scanning the clothesline, the garden, the chicken coop. "Must be a big change though. For a town girl like you." "I'm managing." "Course you are. Question is, how long can you keep managing? Ranch life's hard on women, especially ones not born to it. Lots of things can go wrong out here. Accidents happen." The words were casual, conversational, but the threat underneath was clear as creek water. Mavis straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Briggs?" "Threatening? No, ma'am, just being neighborly. Pointing out that this country can be dangerous for folks who don't know their way around. Take your husband, for instance. He's got a reputation for being difficult when it comes to authority. Sometimes that kind of attitude can bring trouble down on a man's family." "My husband is a law-abiding citizen." "Sure he is. But what about his associates? Man keeps company with certain types, sometimes that comes back to bite him. Like that business with Harris's land deed." Mavis's blood ran cold. "What about William's deed?" Briggs smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, you didn't know? There's some question about whether Harris actually owned that land legal-like. Seems the original deed might have been irregular. Course, don't matter much now, seeing as how it's been sold proper." "Who bought it?" "Private investor from back east. Man who knows the value of good land when he sees it." Briggs remounted his horse, looking down at Mavis with cold satisfaction. "You take care now, Mrs. Stone. Be real careful who you trust out here." He rode away at a leisurely pace, leaving Mavis standing among the wet laundry with her heart pounding. The implications of what he'd said were staggering. If William's deed had been questioned, if there had been irregularities, then his death might not have been the accident everyone claimed. And if powerful people were involved in taking his land, then Mavis and Sadie could be in real danger. That evening, when Caleb returned from the north pasture, Mavis told him about Briggs' visit. She watched his face grow grimmer with each detail, his jaw tightening when she repeated the man's veiled threats. "You think William was murdered?" she asked when she finished. "I think William was asking questions that somebody didn't want answered." Caleb sat heavily in his chair, running a hand through his dark hair. "And I think his deed was probably legitimate, which means somebody falsified documents to get his land cheap." But who would do such a thing? Somebody with connections to the territorial government. Somebody who could influence judges and court clerks, maybe even forge official papers. He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the darkening hills. Somebody like Judge Mosely. The words hung between them like a death sentence. If Judge Mosely was involved in land fraud and William's murder, then their marriage might not be enough to protect Sadie. A corrupt judge could find ways around the law, could manufacture evidence or create circumstances that would give him legal grounds to take the child away. What do we do? Mavis asked. We be very careful. And we start building allies in the community, people who'll stand with us if things get ugly. Over the following weeks, Caleb made good on that promise. He began taking Mavis and Sadie with him when he went to town for supplies, introducing them to shopkeepers and neighbors, making sure everyone knew them as a family unit. They attended church services at the small white church, where Reverend Hayes made a point of welcoming them, and several families invited them for Sunday dinner. Mavis discovered that she liked the social aspects of frontier life more than she'd expected. The women she met were practical, hard-working people who accepted her readily once they saw how well she cared for Sadie and how competently she managed ranch work. Mrs. Weatherby proved to be a font of information about preserving food for winter, while Mrs. Peterson taught her to make soap from lye and animal fat. But even as they built connections in the community, Mavis could feel the pressure building from other quarters. Too often she would catch sight of unfamiliar riders watching the ranch from distant hills. Strange men began appearing in town, asking questions about the Stones and their sudden marriage. Someone broke into their chicken coop one night, killing half the hens but taking nothing, as if the destruction itself was the message. The breaking point came in late August, when Mavis was in the garden with Sadie, teaching her to identify ripe tomatoes, and heard the thunder of approaching horses. Not one or two riders this time, but a whole group, coming fast and raising dust clouds that could be seen for miles. Sadie, run to the house, Mavis said quietly. Find Mrs. Patterson and stay with her. The child obeyed immediately, her weeks on the ranch having taught her to recognize danger. Mavis stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, and watched 8 riders approach the cabin. Judge Mosely led them, but these weren't court officials riding with him. These were hard men with gun belts and cold eyes, the kind who hired out their violence to whoever paid best. Caleb appeared around the side of the cabin, having heard the horses from the barn where he'd been working. He moved with the fluid grace of a man comfortable with trouble, his hand resting casually near the colt at his hip. Judge Mosely, he called out. You're on private property. Indeed I am, Mr. Stone. And I'm here on official business. Mosely held up a folded paper. Court order for the immediate removal of the Harris child. New evidence has come to light regarding her welfare. What evidence? Reports of unsuitable living conditions, inadequate supervision, exposure to immoral influences. Mosely's voice carried across the yard with self-righteous authority. Several concerned citizens have filed complaints with the territorial office. Mavis felt her world tilting. That's not true. Sadie's well cared for, happy, healthy. The child has been observed working in dangerous conditions, exposed to cattle and other hazards inappropriate for a minor. Furthermore, questions have been raised about the legitimacy of your marriage and your husband's fitness as a guardian. Our marriage is legal and recorded, Caleb said. And what questions about my fitness? One of the hired gunmen spoke up, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who'd never met trouble he couldn't shoot his way out of. Word is you've been associating with known troublemakers, Stone. Men who don't respect proper authority. Such as. such as asking questions about certain land transactions that ain't none of your business, stirring up trouble about deeds and legal proceedings that been settled proper. So there it was. They weren't just after Sadie, they were after anyone who might question the legitimacy of William's death and the subsequent land grab. Mavis realized with cold clarity that their only chance was to fight, and fight now, before Mosely's men could take Sadie away and disappear her into the territorial system where no one would ever find her again. "The child stays here," Caleb said quietly. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make." Mosely gestured to his men. "Bring her out." 2 of the gunmen dismounted and started toward the house. That's when Mrs. Patterson appeared on the porch, holding Sadie's hand and wearing an expression of fierce maternal protection that would have done credit to a grizzly bear with cubs. "You men stop right there," she called out. "This child is under the protection of a legal guardian and a lawful marriage. You got no right to take her." "We have a court order, madam. I can read, and I been to more than a few territorial court proceedings in my time." "That paper you're waving around looks mighty fresh for an official document. When exactly did this alleged hearing take place?" Mosely's face flushed. "The territorial court operates on its own schedule." "Which means you made this up in the back room of the saloon." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the authority of a woman who'd raised 6 children and buried a husband on this frontier. "Furthermore, I've been keeping detailed records of this child's care, her health, her education, her daily routine. Any judge who wants to question her welfare is welcome to review my documentation." Mavis felt a surge of gratitude for the older woman's quick thinking. Documentation could make all the difference in a territorial court, where official records often determined legal outcomes. But the gunmen weren't interested in legal niceties. They continued advancing toward the porch, hands moving toward their weapons. That's when the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley again. But this time, Mavis recognized the rhythm. These were neighbors, people she'd come to know over the summer months. Henrik Peterson arrived first, his weathered face grim with purpose. Behind him came Samuel Tucker from town, then the Weatherby men, then others, ranchers and farmers and townspeople who'd heard about Mosely's raid and come to help. Within minutes, the yard was full of armed men on horseback, and Mosely's hired guns found themselves heavily outnumbered. "Afternoon, Judge," Peterson said in his accented English. "Heard you were having some kind of legal proceeding out here. Thought we'd come witness it proper like." "This is official business," Mosely began. "Then it should be conducted in a courtroom, with proper witnesses and legal representation," Samuel Tucker interrupted. He was the town blacksmith, but Mavis had learned he'd read law back east before coming to the territory. "Unless you're saying territorial citizens don't have the right to proper legal proceedings?" The standoff stretched taut as a fiddle string. Mosely's men were tough, but they weren't stupid. 8 guns against 20 wasn't odds any sane man would take, especially when the 20 included people with legal standing in the community. "This isn't over," Mosely said finally, his pale eyes promising future retribution. "The territorial government won't stand for this kind of resistance to lawful authority." "No, sir, it won't," Tucker agreed. "Which is why we'll be sending a full report to the territorial capital about today's proceedings, including witness statements about the irregularity of your court order and the intimidation tactics employed by your associates." Mosely wheeled his horse around and led his men away at a gallop, but not before the lead gunman fixed Caleb with a stare that promised personal violence in the near future. As the dust settled, Mavis found herself surrounded by neighbors who were checking on her welfare, making sure Sadie was all right, and discussing plans for community protection. It was her first real taste of frontier justice. Not the corrupt legal maneuvering of men like Mosely, but the simple democracy of decent people standing together against those who would abuse power. "They'll be back," Peterson warned. "Men like that don't give up easy." "Let them come," Mrs. Weatherby said firmly. "We'll be ready." That evening, after their neighbors had gone home with promises to keep watch and spread word of Mosely's illegal tactics, Mavis sat on the porch with Caleb and Sadie, watching the sun set over the valley that had become their home. The child was playing with a wooden horse Caleb had carved for her, making soft whinnying sounds as she moved it through imaginary pastures. "She's happy here," Mavis said quietly. "She is. Question is, are you?" Mavis considered the question seriously. 3 months ago she'd been a desperate woman with nothing but the clothes on her back and a child who needed protecting. Now she was part of a community, married to a good man who treated her with respect and kindness, living on land that felt like home. "I am," she said, and realized it was true. "Scared sometimes, worried about what Mosely might do next, but happy. Happier than I've been since I was Sadie's age." "Good." Caleb reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "Because whatever comes next, we'll face it together. All 3 of us." As if she'd heard him, Sadie looked up from her wooden horse and smiled, the first genuine, carefree smile Mavis had seen from her since before William died. It was a moment of pure joy, untainted by fear or grief or uncertainty about the future. But even as Mavis treasured that smile, she couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Mosely's threats had been real, and men with his kind of power didn't forgive public humiliation. They would be back, with better plans and more dangerous allies. The question was whether the fragile family they'd built could survive whatever storm was coming. Mavis looked at her husband, because that's what he was now, in all the ways that mattered, and at the child they both loved, and decided it would have to be enough. They'd found something worth fighting for, and fight for it they would, no matter what the cost. The first snow came early that year, dusting the valley in October with a thin white blanket that promised a hard winter ahead. Mavis stood at the kitchen window, watching Sadie help Caleb stack firewood against the cabin wall, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The child had grown stronger over the summer months, her thin frame filling out with good food and hard work, her pale cheeks now touched with healthy color from days spent outdoors. "Storm's coming," Mrs. Patterson observed, looking up from the bread dough she was kneading. "Can feel it in my bones. Going to be a bad one, too." Mavis nodded, though her attention was focused on the riders approaching from the south. 3 men this time, moving at a steady pace through the light snow. Not Mosely's hired guns. These were different, wearing the kind of clothes that suggested official business but carrying themselves like men accustomed to trouble. "Caleb," she called softly. He looked up from the woodpile, following her gaze to the approaching riders. Without a word, he handed Sadie the last piece of wood and guided her toward the house. "Go inside with Mavis and Mrs. Patterson. Stay away from the windows." The child obeyed immediately, her instincts sharpened by months of intermittent threats. Mavis ushered her into the back room, while Mrs. Patterson continued kneading bread, as if armed strangers visited every day. The lead rider dismounted at the porch steps, a tall man with graying hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He wore a badge on his coat, but it wasn't local authority. This was territorial business. "Mr. Stone? I'm Marshal Davis, Territorial Marshal's office. Like to have a word with you." Caleb stepped onto the porch, his hand resting casually near his gun. "Marshal, what brings you out in weather like this?" Questions about Judge Mosely and some irregularities in recent court proceedings. "Mind if we come in? Going to be a long conversation." Mavis felt her heart skip. If the territorial marshals were investigating Mosely, it might mean vindication for William's death and Sadie's custody. But it could also mean more danger if Mosely felt cornered. "Come in," Caleb said. "Coffee's hot." The three men entered, stomping snow off their boots and nodding respectfully to Mavis and Mrs. Patterson. The marshal introduced his companions as Deputy Williams and Clerk Jameson from the territorial capital. "Mrs. Stone," Marshal Davis said, "we've been reviewing some court records from this district, and your name came up in connection with several irregularities. Nothing you've done wrong," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "But we need to ask some questions about Judge Mosely's handling of your stepdaughter's custody case." "What kind of irregularities?" Mavis asked. Deputy Williams opened a leather satchel and pulled out a stack of papers. "For starters, the court order Mosely used to try to remove the child last month? There's no record of any hearing, no documentation of the alleged complaints, no official seal. Appears to have been fabricated." Mrs. Patterson looked up from her bread. "Told you that paper looked fresh." "Yes, ma'am, you did. And your written records of the child's care have been very helpful in our investigation." The marshal accepted a cup of coffee from Mavis gratefully. "But there's more. We've been looking into the Harris land sale, and the deed situation is complicated." Caleb leaned forward. "How complicated?" "The original deed was legitimate, recorded proper with the territorial office. But somebody filed a duplicate claim 6 months ago, saying the first deed was fraudulent. That duplicate claim is what Mosely used to justify the quick auction." "Who filed the duplicate claim?" Mavis asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Shell Company out of Denver. Traced back to a group of investors with ties to several territorial officials." Clerk Jameson consulted his notes, including Judge Mosely himself. The room fell silent except for the crackling of logs in the fireplace. Mavis felt a cold fury building in her chest. They'd killed William for his land, tried to steal Sadie from the only family she had left, all for profit and greed. "What about William's death?" she asked quietly. "That's where things get interesting," Marshal Davis said. "We exhumed the body last week, with permission from you as next of kin. County doctor took a look at the skull fracture. Says it's not consistent with a fall on creek rocks." Meaning somebody hit him with something heavy and angular. Probably a shovel or pick handle. Mavis closed her eyes, feeling sick. Poor William, asking questions about his own land, trying to protect his daughter's inheritance, murdered for his trouble. "We got evidence then," Caleb said. "Evidence of fraud and murder. What are you going to do about it?" "That's where we need your help," the marshal replied. "Mosely's gotten wind that we're investigating. He's planning to run, but first he wants to tie up loose ends. Word is he's put a bounty on anyone who can testify against him." "Including us," Mavis said. "Especially you. The child's custody case was the first crack in his scheme. Your marriage disrupted his plans, and when you fought back with community support, it drew attention to his methods." Marshal Davis set down his coffee cup. "We need you to help us catch him in the act. Let him make another move against you, but this time with official witnesses." "You want to use us as bait," Caleb said flatly. "I want to end this before more innocent people get killed. Mosely's not going to stop with the Harris case. There are at least 6 other suspicious land transfers in this district, and probably more we haven't found yet." Mavis looked toward the back room where Sadie was playing with her wooden animals, safe for the moment but never truly secure as long as Mosely remained free. "What would we have to do?" "Act normal. Go about your business. But when Mosely makes his move, and he will, we'll be ready for him. And if something goes wrong?" If he gets to us before you can stop him, then territorial justice dies with you, Deputy Williams said bluntly. Because Mosely's got connections all the way to the capital, and if he gets away clean this time, he'll be untouchable. The weight of responsibility settled on Mavis's shoulders like a heavy coat. They weren't just fighting for Sadie anymore, or even for justice for William. They were fighting for the rule of law itself in this territory, for the principle that power couldn't simply take whatever it wanted from those too weak to resist. "We'll do it," she said before Caleb could object. "But Sadie gets protected. Whatever happens to us, she gets kept safe." "Already arranged," Marshal Davis assured her. Mrs. Patterson's agreed to take her to her sister's place in Colorado Springs if things go bad. "But it won't come to that. We'll be watching." The marshals left that afternoon, disappearing into the swirling snow like ghosts. Mavis spent the evening teaching Sadie to darn socks by lamplight while Caleb cleaned his rifle and checked the loads in his pistol. Mrs. Patterson hummed hymns while she cooked supper, her calm presence a steadying influence on them all. "Why are the bad men angry at us?" Sadie asked suddenly, looking up from her careful stitches. Mavis considered how to answer. The child had been through so much already, had lost one father to violence and greed. But she also deserved honesty about the dangers they faced. "Because we're trying to keep you safe, and they want to take you away for reasons that have nothing to do with what's best for you." "Like they took Papa's land?" "Yes, sweetheart. Like they took your Papa's land." Sadie nodded solemnly, then returned to her sewing. But Mavis noticed that she stayed closer to the adults after that, and slept with her wooden horse clutched tight in her arms. The attack came 3 days later, during the worst blizzard of the early season. Mavis was in the kitchen preparing supper when she heard the barn door banging in the wind. Caleb had gone out to check the cattle an hour ago and should have been back by now. "Something's wrong," she told Mrs. Patterson. "Caleb wouldn't leave the barn door open in this weather." Mrs. Patterson nodded grimly. "Get Sadie and the rifle. I'll bank the fire." But before Mavis could move, the kitchen window exploded inward in a shower of glass and snow. A burning rag wrapped around a stick landed on the floor, immediately catching the scattered wood shavings Caleb had been using for kindling. "Fire!" Mrs. Patterson shouted, grabbing a pot of water from the stove. Mavis ran for Sadie, scooping the child up from where she'd been playing near the fireplace. "Out the back door." They stumbled into the storm, the wind driving snow so hard Mavis could barely see 10 feet ahead. Behind them, flames were already licking at the kitchen walls, spreading faster than seemed possible. "The barn!" Mrs. Patterson shouted over the wind. "Caleb's in the barn." They fought their way through knee-deep snow toward the dark bulk of the barn, Sadie clinging to Mavis's neck and whimpering with cold and fear. The barn door stood open, banging rhythmically against the wall in the wind. Inside, they found Caleb tied hand and foot to a support post, blood trickling from a cut on his head. 3 men stood over him, and Mavis recognized 2 of them from Mosely's previous visits. The third was Mosely himself, looking older and more desperate than she'd ever seen him. "Mrs. Stone," he said with cold politeness. "So good of you to join us. I was just explaining to your husband how unfortunate accidents can happen during winter storms." "Let him go," Mavis said, though her voice shook with more than cold. "I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, the 3 of you have become quite inconvenient to my business interests. But a tragic fire during a blizzard, followed by exposure when you tried to escape. Well, these things happen on the frontier." One of Mosely's men stepped forward, raising a club toward Caleb's head. That's when Sadie spoke up, her young voice cutting through the wind. "You're the bad man who killed my papa." Mosely turned to look at her, his pale eyes reflecting the flames now visible through the barn door. "Smart child. Yes, I killed your father." He was asking too many questions, threatening to expose business arrangements that were none of his concern. "Why did you want his land so bad?" Sadie asked. "Because land is power, child. And power is everything." Mosely gestured to his men. "Finish this. We need to be gone before the storm clears." That's when the barn filled with armed men, materializing out of the snow like avenging angels. Marshal Davis led them, his badge gleaming in the firelight, followed by Deputy Williams and half a dozen other territorial officers. "Nobody move," Davis shouted. "Territorial marshals." Mosely's men went for their guns, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard. The brief gunfight filled the barn with thunder and smoke, ending when two of the hired guns lay dead in the straw and Mosely stood with his hands raised, blood streaming from a wounded arm. "Judge Mosely," Marshal Davis said formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and murder." "You have no authority here," Mosely snarled. "I am a duly appointed territorial judge." "You were a territorial judge. As of this morning, you've been officially removed from office and charged with corruption." Deputy Williams produced a set of iron shackles. "You're going to Denver to stand trial." As the marshals secured their prisoners and put out the fire that had spread to one wall of the barn, Mavis untied Caleb and checked his injuries. The cut on his head was superficial, though he'd have a fierce headache for days. "How did they know to come now?" she asked Marshal Davis. "Been watching from the hills all week. When we saw the smoke and the storm, figured Mosely would use the weather as cover." The marshal looked down at Sadie, who was still clinging to Mavis's hand. "That was brave, what you did in there. Speaking up like that." "He needed to say what he did," Sadie replied seriously. "So you could hear him." Mavis realized the child was right. Mosely's confession in front of official witnesses would seal his fate in territorial court. Sadie, who had lost so much to this man's greed, had played a crucial role in bringing him to justice. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the storm blown out and the valley sparkling under fresh snow. Mavis stood on the porch, watching the marshals prepare to leave with their prisoners. Mosely sat hunched in the wagon bed, shackled and defeated, no longer the imposing figure who had terrorized them for months. "What happens now?" she asked Marshal Davis. "Now you live your lives," he replied. "The Harris land will be returned to the child's estate, held in trust until she comes of age. The other stolen properties will be returned to their rightful owners. And the territorial government will be taking a much closer look at how land disputes are handled in this district." "And Sadie's custody?" "Already settled. New territorial judge reviewed the case yesterday. You and your husband are her legal guardians, with full adoption papers if you want them." Mavis felt tears prick her eyes. After all the fear and fighting, it was that simple. Sadie was theirs, legally and permanently, with no one left who could challenge their right to raise her. That afternoon, the community gathered at the Stone Ranch for an impromptu celebration. Word had spread quickly about Mosely's arrest and the resolution of the land fraud case. Neighbors arrived with food and drink, musical instruments and stories, turning the traumatic events into a festival of justice served. Henrik Peterson brought his fiddle, and Samuel Tucker produced a harmonica, and soon the cabin was filled with music and laughter. Children played in the snow outside while adults shared stories around the fire and planned for the spring planting season. Mavis found herself standing in the doorway, watching Sadie chase the Peterson boys in a game of snow tag, her laughter bright and carefree in the cold air. The child had been through so much, losing her father, facing an uncertain future, living with constant threats and danger. But she was resilient, as frontier children had to be, and she was finally, truly safe. Regrets? Caleb asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. Mavis considered the question seriously. 6 months ago she'd been a desperate woman with no prospects, agreeing to a marriage of convenience to protect a child she loved. Now she was part of a real family, accepted by a community that had rallied to defend her, living on land that felt like home. No regrets, she said. Not about any of it. Good. He slipped his arm around her waist, a gesture that had become natural over the months of shared work and worry. Because I was thinking we might make this arrangement permanent. In all the ways that matter. Mavis looked up at him, seeing not the stranger who had offered them sanctuary, but the man who had stood with her against every threat, who had worked beside her through every season, who had loved Sadie like his own daughter from the very beginning. I'd like that, she said. That evening, after the neighbors had gone home and Sadie was asleep in her bed, Mavis sat with Caleb on the porch, wrapped in quilts against the cold. The stars were brilliant in the clear sky, and the silence was peaceful rather than threatening for the first time since spring. Do you think she remembers much about before? Caleb asked, gesturing toward the window of Sadie's room. Some. But children are good at building new memories over old ones. Give her enough happy days, and the sad ones will fade. And what about you? Think the sad days will fade? Mavis considered this. The grief of losing William, the terror of nearly losing Sadie, the months of living under constant threat, those memories would always be part of her. But they were balanced now by other memories. Sadie's first smile at the ranch, the community rallying to protect them, the quiet satisfaction of building something good and lasting together. The sad days made the happy ones possible, she said finally. If William hadn't died, if Mosely hadn't threatened us, we never would have found each other. Sadie never would have had this home, this family, this community. So you're saying something good came out of all that pain? I'm saying pain and joy are all part of the same story. You can't have one without the other, not if you're really living. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the snow-covered valley that stretched away into darkness. Think Sadie will remember this? The ranch, the work, the way it felt to be safe. I think she'll remember that she was loved, Mavis said. And that when bad things happened, good people stood up to make them right. That's the important part. A few weeks later, as winter deepened and the work settled into the steady rhythm of cold weather chores, Mavis received a letter from Denver. It was from the territorial court, informing her that Judge Mosely had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and murder. His assets were being liquidated to compensate his victims, including a substantial payment to Sadie's trust fund. But more importantly, the letter contained official adoption papers, making Sadie legally and permanently a stone. Mavis read the documents twice, then walked out to the barn where Caleb was repairing harness and Sadie was playing with the barn cats. Sadie, she called. Come here, sweetheart. Got something to show you. The child approached, wiping cat hair off her hands on her wool skirt. She'd grown several inches over the winter, and her face had lost the pinched, frightened look that had haunted her for so long. What is it, Mama? She asked, and Mavis's heart swelled at the word the child had started using just after Christmas. Official papers from the territorial court. Says you're Sadie Stone now, legal and binding. Caleb's your papa and I'm your mama, and nobody can ever change that. Sadie studied the papers solemnly, running her finger over the official seal. Does this mean I don't have to worry about the bad men anymore? It means you don't have to worry about anything anymore except growing up strong and happy. Good, Sadie said, and handed the papers back. Can I name the new kittens now? Mavis laughed, tucking the adoption papers into her apron pocket. Trust a child to take momentous legal developments in stride and focus on what really mattered, like naming barn cats and planning spring adventures. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind howl around the cabin, Mavis reflected on the strange turns life could take. A year ago she'd been certain about what Judge Mosely had said in that courthouse, that she was unfit to care for Sadie, that they would take the child away from her forever. But she'd been wrong about what she'd heard, just as everyone had told her. Mosely hadn't been pronouncing legal judgment that day. He'd been planning a kidnapping, setting up a fraud that would have destroyed multiple families for the sake of profit. Sometimes being wrong about what you heard was the best thing that could happen to you. Sometimes the truth was better than you dared to hope. Outside, the wind carried the promise of spring still months away, but Mavis wasn't worried about the long winter ahead. They had food stored, would cut, and each other. They had a community that would help them through hard times and celebrate with them during good ones. Most importantly, they had something worth protecting. A family built not on blood or legal convenience, but on love and choice and the daily decision to stand together against whatever troubles might come. In the next room, Sadie murmured in her sleep, probably dreaming of spring planting or new foals or the 100 other possibilities that stretched ahead of them. Mavis smiled in the darkness, listening to the sound of the child's peaceful breathing, and knew that whatever the judge had actually said in that courthouse so many months ago, what mattered was what they'd built together since then. They were home.